Hi there everyone. Welcome to this week's video where we're going to talk about Spinoza's Metaphysics. For this week we read all of book 1 and a little smidget of book 2 of the ethics, right? So really difficult material. In this video, we're really just going to get through a lot of the very basics, big picture stuff about Spinoza's view, and I will try to give you the necessary tools and resources in order to continue trudging through the text, right? This is one of those books where you kind of have to keep reading it over and over again over the course of an entire lifetime to fully understand it. We obviously can't accomplish that in the context of our class, but we can start to get a handle on the basic ideas of Spinoza's ethics and see where that takes us. I want to start out by showing you a little convention that scholars of Spinoza and the ethics use to refer to it. You know, you might read some secondary literature, or you might want to be able to make a quick reference to a particular proposition or proof or something like that. And scholars have developed a kind of way to do that at first just looks like kind of a series of random letters and numbers. I've written an example up here on the board: E1, P14, C2, right? So you might see someone say something about Spinoza and then have this little thing written in parentheses, right? So let's break this down together because it's pretty easy actually to figure out what it means. So the E just means that the person is referring to the book that we're reading together, the Ethics, right? And the number immediately following the E specifies whether what we're looking at is book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4, or book 5 of the Ethics. The Ethics basically has 5 chapters. This is you stating what chapter it is that you are talking about. This is necessary because Spinoza, for example, will restart his numbering of the propositions each chapter, right? So E2 P7 is going to be different than E1 P7, right? So E and then the number just specifies what book or chapter it is that we are looking at together. Next is the P, right? So this is refers to the proposition, right? If you've been trudging through the ethics, you've noticed that there are axioms and definitions and propositions, right? And most often it's propositions, right? In the main body of the text, Spinoza provides a number of propositions, and then he proves the proposition, and then he moves on to the next one, right? But it can also be an axiom or a definition. So E1D1, for example, would be the first definition of book 1 of the Ethics, right? So that's what that second little segment of a letter and a number refers to. Finally, sometimes you'll see a third little part of this code, as it were. And this refers to specific aspects of Spinoza's argument underneath the proposition. So sometimes Spinoza will attach a scholium or a corollary underneath the proposition. These are related topics or ideas that he feels that it's appropriate to discuss after providing the proof of the proposition. So if you want to refer specifically to those, right, you simply tack on to the code that we've already developed so far, just corollary, so C, or scholium, S, and then whatever one it is, right? Sometimes Spinoza has several of these scholiums or corollaries, right? So this is just a handy little system for finding your place throughout the entirety of the Ethics, right? And so in this video and in the next few videos, I might say things like E1 P15, right? Or something like that, right? I'll probably clarify afterwards because that's a little bit awkward to say, but nevertheless, it should be in your toolkit if you're looking at secondary literature or you'd like to just be able to write this stuff out quicker for yourself. Now, Spinoza starts the Ethics with a lot of definitions and axioms, right? And it can be really, really hard to get a handle on what Spinoza's vocabulary means in this context, right? You don't have a lot of explanation, right? You're simply kind of given these definitions that Spinoza thinks are self-evident, right? But they're actually pretty highly specific to his own way of thinking, right? But I want you to pay special attention to three of those definitions, three terms that in a certain way make up the entirety of Spinoza's metaphysics, right? And those three terms are substance, attribute, and mode, right? We should be familiar basically with this vocabulary up until this point. However, Spinoza is going to define them in a pretty unique way, right? Spinoza says that substance is that which is conceived through itself, or causa sui. We already know this to be Spinoza's conception of substance from our analysis of the Letter on the Infinite. And we have already seen how this idea was already in Descartes' thinking, specifically in the Principles of Philosophy. Spinoza is going to argue throughout the Ethics, but especially in roughly the first 15 or 20 propositions of Book 1 of the Ethics, he's going to argue that there can be one and only one substance in the universe. And he's going to try to give a prolonged argument to that effect, right? So this is kind of what scholars refer to as Spinoza's monism. So if Descartes was a dualist in the sense that he thought that there were two distinct classes of substances, Spinoza, to the contrary, is a monist in the sense that he insists that there's one and only one substance in the universe. We'll see in the next video that Spinoza actually does endorse certain aspects of Descartes' dualism, and that eventually is going to make him a dual aspect monist, right? But we're not quite at the point where we can give a full account of that right now. Right? But what's important now to note is that Spinoza is going to demonstrate really, that there's one and only one substance in the universe, and that is a necessary fact about the essence of substance. So if you understand what substance really means, then you should know, consequently, that there can be one and only one substance, right? And moreover, there must be one substance, right? It couldn't be that there are no substances in the universe, or that substance does not exist. We'll give more of an argument for this based on, as I mentioned, the first 15 or 20 propositions of the Ethics below. But now let's talk about two other aspects of Spinoza's view, namely his theory of attributes and modes. It's important that Spinoza is not like a mystic, right? He's not like Parmenides or a figure like that in the history of philosophy who wants to argue that the appearance of there being several distinct things in our reality, right? So, for example, a phone or a book or a person, right, are merely an illusion. And the truth is that there's one and only one thing in the universe, what mystics will sometimes call God or being, or what is, TSD, or, something like that, right? Spinoza is a monist, so he does want to say, really, there is only one substance in the universe, but he also wants to preserve what we could call, in our naive vocabulary, the existence of particular individuals. So Spinoza doesn't think that it's wrong, for example, to say that there's a book and a phone and a person, and all of those are different things, right? He's going to actually acknowledge that those are different things. Those are different modes in his vocabulary, right? But his monism is going to make him insist that, okay, but you have an inadequate understanding if you can't recognize as a part of their differences that they're both part of the universe, right? So they're different aspects, they're different expressions, we could say, of the universe, but they belong essentially to the same universe. So Spinoza wants to be able to give a fully fleshed out scientific account of regular stuff in nature, and to do so in a way that preserves their individuality, but with the constant reminder that those individuals are dependent on the substance that they are a part of. So Spinoza defines modes, and again, we should already be familiar with this definition, as affections of the substances. So it's a way that substance comes to be affected or affect itself, right? Alternatively, Spinoza says that modes are what is through another, right? So, like, I'm not a substance on Spinoza's account. I am a mode, right? I am through another, right? In other words, if my parents weren't born, for example, then I would have never been born, right? I was caused through the existence of another. And moreover, I persevere through other things. So, for example, my lungs are filled with oxygen right now, and it's on that condition that I can continue to exist. If they start to be filled with toxic fumes or shards of glass or something like that, right, then I would very quickly die and cease to exist, right? So modes, finite stuff, these are what changes in the substance. These are expressions of substance, right? They exist through the nature of another. And this is, again, another topic that we're going to discuss in more detail in our next video. Now, Spinoza thinks that we also perceive different classes of modes. So, for example, Spinoza accepts Descartes' idea that informs his dualism that ideas and bodies are totally different from one another, right? And the way that they have causal relations is totally different from one another. Spinoza absolutely accepts this, and moreover, he accepts this so strongly that it causes him to reject Descartes' interactionism. So Spinoza thinks that bodies and minds, what he would call extension and thought, these are how the modifications of God show up to us, alternatively as bodies or ideas, right? So Spinoza is going to say that you can know from the nature of substance, from the nature of attributes, from the nature of modes, that there has to be one and only one substance, that there are two and only two attributes. You can put an asterisk here and say, actually, Spinoza says there are an infinite number of attributes, but we only know two of them, namely extension and thought, right? So that little hedge aside, we can say there are two attributes, right? And then how many modes are there? Infinitely many, right? So we have the structure where there's one substance, there's one universe that we can alternatively call God or nature. There's then two classes of stuff within that universe, namely bodies and ideas, and that there's an infinite number of that stuff, right? Those modes or modifications. And that's sort of Spinoza's picture of the universe. It's regularly likened, for example, to think about the ocean and the ocean's waves. In a sense, the waves are radically particular and individuated. You can tell the difference between one wave and another. But on the other hand, both of the waves are nothing but the ocean, right? You would be mistaken, for example, if you didn't recognize that two independent waves, both part of the Pacific Ocean, were not part of the Pacific Ocean, right? In other words, there are two different ways that the ocean comes to express itself, right? So the waves are like modes or modifications for Spinoza, and the ocean itself, singular and so on, right? That which causes all of the waves, that is substance. Now in this video, let's give a brief reconstruction of Spinoza's arguments for monism. And I've simplified Spinoza's argument immensely here. So it might be that this is far less detailed than the full argument that Spinoza gives at the beginning of the Ethics, but nevertheless, I think it suffices to show his points, right? Premise 1, and this is a definition, so it shouldn't be controversial at this point. Substance is that which is unlimited, causa sui. To say that substance is a cause of itself is to say something like, well, it can't be conditioned by the existence of anything else, right? I explained that I'm a mode because I'm conditioned in various ways on the existence of other finite stuff, right? Substance is supposed to be independent of those things, right? Those are modifications, affections of the substance, right? Premise 2, if there were two or more substances, they would limit each other, right? In other words, if there are two or more substances in the universe, then there's something in the universe, namely substance 2, that substance 1 is limited with respect to, right? If there are two substances, then substance 1 is limited, it is finite, it is conditioned by substance 2, and vice versa, right? So if you really think that substance is that which is by nature unlimited, then you must know from this fact that there can't be two or more substances. It belongs to the nature of substance that there be one infinite, eternal substance, right? You can also know, for example, that the substance exists, right? How can you know that this substance exists? Well, because according to the PSR, there has to be a reason for something to either exist or to not exist. Substance is not conditioned by anything, and so has no conditions under which it does not exist, right? And so that makes it belong to the nature of substance to exist. So a lot of the first part of the Ethics is devoted to Spinoza proving from the definition of substance he's provided that the substance must be one, infinite, and eternal, right? And hence worthy of the term God, right? God or nature. Now let's get into one topic before we move on to our next video, and that concerns Spinoza's religion, right? Where does all of this God talk leave him in terms of the religious landscape of the 17th century? Right? And really, I've offered two readings that offer two pretty radically different perspectives on this issue. Namely, our good friend Pierre Bayle, who I have quite a lot of affection for, and Gotthold Lessing, another figure that I actually like quite a lot. These two figures contributed greatly to Spinoza's legacy throughout the years. Ultimately, Bayle is the most significant commentator and interpreter of Spinoza in the history of European philosophy, or at least so I would argue. That's because Bayle was the first person to call Spinoza an atheist. And that's the reputation that Spinoza had throughout Europe for hundreds of years. To call someone a Spinozist was the same thing as calling them an atheist, and therefore also calling for them to be punished in some capacity, right? Dismissed as a university lecturer, for example. That's kind of ironic because Baal himself was accused of atheism, but nevertheless, right? Baal argues that Spinoza is an atheist, right? Now, Baal acknowledges that Spinoza argues that God exists, right? And so that's weird, right? You don't normally get a lot of atheists who are providing rational a priori arguments for the necessary existence of God, right? But nevertheless, I think Baal really does have a point, right? Namely, that on Baal's view, Spinoza's God exists, but he has no purpose for the universe, right? For a traditional religious conception, God created the universe in order to fulfill a kind of moral purpose, right? Spinoza's metaphysics has no place for that, right? Spinoza is just not interested in the idea of telos, or purposes in the world. He doesn't think that you can actually come to know anything about the world in that way, right? And so that sort of vacates God in religion of its normal kind of messages, right? Which is namely that our life here is a kind of moral test, right? And it, even with all of its evil and so on, it goes on to achieve a broadly moral purpose. And this becomes even more absurd for Baal when you really accept Spinoza's monism, right? Whenever you accept that everything in the universe is like an expression of God, right? That immediately has the consequence that when people in the world, for example, are evil, that what we should really say is that God was evil, right? If I think one thing, if I think A and you think not A, then really at the end of the day, it's God who thinks A and not A through Penny and her interlocutor, right? And so Baal recognizes that for Spinoza, God exists, but he argues that Spinoza's God is fundamentally absurd, right, and nihilistic. It vacates the world of its moral purposes. And hence, even though Spinoza argues that God exists, we should still rightly regard Spinoza as an atheist. And indeed, perhaps the most cunning atheist at all. The first atheist who would dare say, not that God doesn't exist, but that even if he does exist, that he's not perfect or necessarily happy, right? That's an even more audacious kind of atheism for Baal. Now, Lessing, to the contrary, wants to argue that Spinoza is actually much friendlier to conventional forms of monotheism, right? Some authors, for example, this Jewish figure, philosopher I really like, Salomon Maimon, has claimed that Spinozism was the truth of Judaism, or the secret of Judaic religion, right? In other words, that if we take the moral message of Judaism really seriously, then we arrive more or less at Spinoza's point of view. And so for Lessing, Spinoza is a creative monotheist, what we would call a pantheist, right? Pan means all, right? God is everything, right? And the way that Spinoza puts this himself in the Ethics is in E1P15, where Spinoza says, whatever is in God, right? And so for Lessing, Baal is wrong to call Spinoza an atheist, because Spinoza claims that God exists, that religion is a necessary institution for society, and moreover, that we only find blessedness in the love of God, you know? And Lessing's argument is accordingly that Baal is rather narrow-minded, right, in his understanding of religion. It's like you're Christian or you're an atheist, right? And Lessing is trying to argue for a more expansive conception of religion. we're still just at the surface, but I'm really interested in hearing what you all think. Do you agree with Dale that Spinoza is an atheist, or do you agree with Lessing that Spinoza is a kind of creative monotheist, right? A pantheist. What do you think of Spinoza's religion? What do you think of Spinoza's philosophy? Is this convincing to you or not? I very much look forward to hearing what you think, and I will see you in the next video.